Hello, welcome back. We're continuing the last chapter of 1 Timothy 6, and we're going to go through it really carefully. And this is the third lesson on the topic. And today's topic is pretty obvious. I think it's one we can all relate to. Money, money, money. Is it good? Is it bad? What place does it have in our life? Does the Bible talk about it? These will all be part of what we'll get into today. So that will get you thinking. And we will come back to that in just a couple of minutes. Now, remember a couple of things. In the very first part of the book, in this chapter, it says, "Let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regarding their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground they are brothers. Rather, they must all serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved." And we talked about that passage at length. But one thing I'm just going to note for today is some of this relates to money, the idea of being a bondservant, the relationship, whether it was in the time where people had literal masters of sorts, or today when we have a master of a job. Money itself can at times be a master. So there's of course, full-on context to that, but there's also some monetary aspects for sure. Well, last week we spent a lot of time talking about the two sides of the gospel and about the importance of doctrine and talking about where we get our doctrine, and that it should be focused clearly on the Bible and God's Word and what Jesus taught us. And there was also things that were contrary to the gospel. But also in that passage, I wanted to note, there was the discussion, as we concluded, that there were those who were called out for their false doctrine and their false teaching. And one of the things that marked them was an unhealthy relationship with seeking gain, and that godliness is a means of gain. And that was a problem. And we even looked at how Jesus came against false doctrine, and when there were the money changers, he overturned them, and he was angry, and he called out them for that. He called out the false teachers. So that gives us just a little bit of context as we now kind of continue after that last thought, imagining that godliness is a means of gain, to think about, again, this topic of today. What role does money play in your life? Well, of course, some listening have more money and some have less. But for each and every one of us, money is not something we can ignore. It is an important part of our life. It's something we have to deal with almost daily. Well, another question is this. Does the Bible have anything at all to say about money? Okay. You might say, well, no, the Bible and money, the Bible doesn't speak about money. Well, I think we've seen a few references already a little bit earlier, and certainly we're going to see a lot more today. In terms of that question, it's often misunderstood, but it permeates the Bible. In fact, it's an important part of who we are. There are over 2,000 verses in the Bible that speak to some degree about money. Jesus taught many lessons directly on money. He had parables about money. I think of just one passage kind of related to this idea of the beginning of 1 Timothy 6. Matthew 6:24 says, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." So it sounds like the passage is probably going to say a whole lot of bad things about those who are rich. Well, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. And that's why it's important that we look at it all in context and study it out. And so this passage we're looking at today is one of several, but it's one important passage on money, and we're going to look at it carefully. So let's first read the whole passage. "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich and to fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Now, often, this is one of the most misquoted sections of the Bible, but let's just start at the beginning and study it verse by verse. But godliness with contentment is great gain. In contrast, that those that wanted to use a mixture of godliness for their gain, which was called out, godliness with contentment is great gain. So as I said before, money is not a trivial part of our life. I'm not here to tell you to ignore it, that it's not important, that it's not influential. However, we often overemphasize and think that money itself, if you get a raise, if you get the right job, for some that they hit the lottery, whatever it may be, that's going to solve all their problems and they'll be happy forever. And that's not the case. It is neutral. It is an external tool. It's just something that we have. And it can be used for many things, but it can't buy everything. For example, the passage itself speaks about contentment. Can you be wealthy? By the way, wealth is relative. If we were in some other countries, I think every one of us would be seen as very wealthy. But regardless, well, put in your definition of wealth. Can you be wealthy but not be content? There are people out there, millionaires, many times over, maybe in some cases billionaires, yet they're not content. They want more money. They want more power. They don't have relationships or whatever it may be. And if you recall, we did an in-depth study of Ecclesiastes. And he called it vanity of vanities. The man who knew at the time the greatest wealth that had ever been seen, yet he said all that wealth itself and the power he obtained and everything could not in itself produce being content. On the flip side, can you not be wealthy and be content? There are people that live lives full of great contentment, satisfaction, fulfillment, joy in their life, and they really don't have any money. I say, well, money itself is not going to be able to buy you contentment. And I ask you the question, are you content? What makes you content? These are questions that are internal ones. These are ones we all have to ponder. That's what's great about the Bible. It speaks to each of us as individuals. Going on, it says, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. You've heard the phrase, you can't take it with you. So we all, of course, think about our net worth. We may think about our retirement. We may think about our house or 401k or whatever it may be. People have always thought about their treasure. But what's the purpose? What are we building it for? With what treasure will you be satisfied? What are we building this treasure for? Well, Matthew 6:19 tells us this. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I think of the parable of the foolish rich man. And actually, now that I mention it, there are several of those. We can think of Lazarus and the rich man. We can think of the rich young ruler when Jesus said, you sell all that you have and follow me. But I'm thinking of the one that said, soul, your barns are full. You've gotten plenty. Eat, drink, and be merry. And he's called a fool because said, you fool, on this very night your life will be taken from you. People think a lot about building up enough retirement, and these are important things to do. I'm not saying we should ignore them, but they're not the focus of our life. Also, the sad thing is this. Many people do think about building up that nest egg and the treasures on earth, but the vast majority of people think nothing of storing up the treasures in heaven. My question for you is, again, are you content, and what makes you content? Is it an earthly treasure, or is it a heavenly treasure? Jesus says, if we have food and clothing, we should be content. I think almost everybody listening to this would have food and clothing. I think almost everybody listening would have a roof over their head. Sometimes what we want for contentment is really just the abundance of things. Final verse, final part of the passage. And this is particularly the most misquoted part. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils, and it is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. So clearly Jesus, the Bible, it all just teaches that if you have wealth, if you are, rich, then you're just bad. And if you don't have those riches, we are good. I've spoken with people. They say, well, I don't have any problems with money at all because I don't have much money. But let's dissect the verse a little deeper. What does it say? Does it say those who are rich? It says those who desire to be rich. A person may have no money, but that's their constant thought every day. That's what they're dreaming of. They're lusting after. They're envious. They want it. So a person with wealth can have an unhealthy occupation and desire for more and more and more, and it may be bad. Another wealthy person may use the resources that they have for good. A poor person may not have much money, but they have this desire. They have senseless and harmful desires. They're always dreaming. Oh, I wish I had this. Oh, I wish I had that. They have a love for it. They have a craving for it. Look at how it's described. And it plunges people into ruin and destruction. Now, you may have heard the misquote that money's the root of all evil, and that's not true. It's that love of money, and it's a root of all kinds of evils, and it's true. Think of the sins that we have. Think of stealing. Think of what people would do for money. Think about how people spend their time, how they're preoccupied with it. It leads to all kinds of problems. It leads to all kinds of hurts. Some people think, well, if I win the lottery or if this happens to me, all my problems would be solved. And that's not the case at all. When you crave something, when you want it so bad, when you lust after it, it can cause you to wander away. It can become the master of your life. And it ultimately can pierce you with many pangs. Money's a complicated topic. So we got to find the right balance in our life. Money itself is neutral. So first, I think when I study the Bible out, having money or not having money is not the issue. We are all stewards. What you have is what you've been given. And then what are you going to do with it? We are all going to be accountable for how we use the resources that are given to us. The gifts that we have, the time that we have, these are all treasures as well as our money. Also, we should be content. So ultimately, if we're not content and we're angry with God because of the lack of money or resources we think we should have, we're really not content with Him because God owns it all. So we should be thankful that this is what God has given us. And by the way, have you had food today and the ability to eat? Do you have clothing? Do you have shelter? Are you content? What is it that you want? And then ultimately, what is your relationship? It's not about what you have. It's not about what you don't have. It's about being faithful with what you have. It's about keeping money in the proper place. If you have a lot, then God has blessed you with that. But that itself is not going to give you joy, contentment. Again, all this can go not only with this passage in 1 Timothy, but also in Ecclesiastes. Money should be used in proper context. It should not be the master of our life. It is just an instrument. It's just a resource. And you can always ask God, just as you can pray for healing. If you have a need, we're not supposed to be anxious. We're supposed to pray and ask. There's certainly no promises that we'll be rich. If you happen to be rich, then you have a responsibility to use those resources in a good way. It's always important, particularly with these sometimes controversial passages, to read them carefully, to make sure we're not making them say something they're not saying. I encourage you to study this passage for yourself, and I'll leave you with those two questions that we've mentioned several times today. Are you content? And what is your relationship with money?